I see. I thought I was getting around it, but okay. Sooner or later. So, hi again, everyone. Thanks for coming to Chromatic Wednesday, Season 3, Episode 21, running under the title Some of Hell is Born of Good Manners, a screening and conversation with Final Girls Berlin Film Festival. We're very happy to welcome Sara Neidorf, who together with Lewy, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight, runs the festival. Since 2017, the Final Girls Berlin Film Festival showcases horror cinema directed, written or produced by women and non-binary filmmakers. Beside the festival, Sara and Eli are programming screenings, workshops and talks, which they are showing in cinemas in Germany, internationally and also online. Tonight's program was put together in conversation between the four of us, basically, sharing films over the past month. It combines films and artist moving image by Gloria, Camiruaga, Cantor, Marinah, Janello, Maria, Martinez, Bayona, Laura Moss, Jordan Strafer, and Emily Wilson. You can also find more info on the individual artist in the screening notes you will find on the table. The screening runtime in total is about 80 minutes. Eerie, macabre, and comedic, the works shown tonight find a haunting and at times sadistic sense of pleasure in deconstructing the filmic conventions of horror cinema. By digesting images of the normative, intact body as a whole, they appropriate and transform the tropes of the genre, revealing the everyday horror that surrounds us. After the screening, there will be a short break, and then Sara will join us again for a conversation. As mentioned earlier, this event is part of the Chromatic Wednesday series, organized by Apartment Project, where we want to say a big thank you to Emre and Meli at the tech desk.
And BJ?
I'm sorry. From the Apartment Project, who put so much work in this event and also the whole series running through this year. Besides, we also want to thank Grace Baggett, who is currently doing an internship at Anorak and who is running the bar tonight and has been of great help with the process to prepare this event. Last but not least, we also want to thank the Anorak e.V. members and board for their continuous support. Quick disclaimer, as it is horror films tonight, there will be kind of bodily violence in the film. If you feel uncomfortable at any time, please feel free to leave or also give us a sign or get in touch with us. That said, please blow out your candles if they're still running and enjoy the screening.
Okay. Thanks for watching. We will have a conversation and there's time to ask questions. We will start with a few and you're welcome to join in. First of all, welcome again, Sara Neidorf. Neidorf, thank you. Who has a background in film studies and is, of course, director of Final Films Festival, Final Girls Berlin Film Festival, but is also a drummer and a musician and has several band projects like Aptera and Mellow Death, and is collaborating with various artists. So, of course, tonight we invited you as a film programmer, and we had a lot of fun putting together this screening and diving into the films that you sent, which is how we started this conversation. We were sending each other films, and horror and genre film, or the horror genre not being our natural habitat, coming more from experimental film, which is also, tonight you saw a combination of those. And first of all, I wanted to ask you about how Final Girls Film Festival came together, and maybe you can also tell us a little bit about the final girl trope, which comes from horror.
Sure, thanks for having me here tonight, and Ellie, my co-director, would have loved to have been here too, but she's out of town right now. It was really a lot of fun putting this program together, and the exchange, and I think we probably sent you a few dozen films over the course of a few weeks, and it was really interesting to see which ones ended up being your favorites for this program. I don't think I ever would have guessed. So the festival has existed since 2017. We started conceptualizing it in 2016, and as you mentioned earlier, we show horror films written and/or directed by women and non-binary filmmakers. We also have talks, workshops, panels, online events, etc. And we're not the first festival of this kind. There have been a few others. There was one in Los Angeles called Viscera Film Festival, which then became Etheria Film Night, which still exists. And there was Scream Queen Film Festival in Tokyo, which came about shortly after that. The first one was in 2007. And since then, there have been like a couple others, mostly in the US, that have come and gone, lasted for 2 or 3 years here and there. And now we're the only one in Germany for sure, but I'm not sure about mainland Europe, possibly also mainland Europe. I believe there's a festival in the UK that does something. So yeah, that's a niche we're trying to, it's a gap we're trying to fill in the film scene here in Berlin, and I believe elsewhere this is also a gap. And yeah, it's an endlessly generative principle, I think, to organize the festival, because every year we get like almost exponentially more really, really promising work, and there's never enough time to show all the stuff that that we wish to. So the final girl trope, which was where we obviously got our name from, is I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with it. Anyone heard of the final girl? No? It's a film trope that was originated by Carol Clover in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which was written in 1992, and mostly she was studying slasher films from the 70s and 80s, and particularly focusing on this figure of the final girl, which she named, which is the last woman standing in these films. Normally, if there were like kind of a cast of youth, maybe 5 or 10 of these young people who were kind of stuck in a really precarious situation, fighting a monster or a villain or a serial killer or some kind of a masked figure that is out to get them and kill them off one by one. There was this recurring theme in a lot of these 70s and 80s slasher films, which was that there was a woman who would survive at the end, who would outsmart everyone and be kind of the last one standing, and would then be the one to tell the tale as well. So that was also important, was that her survival was kind of like the thing that enabled the narrative to exist almost. Yeah, but there were also like there's some ambiguous things about this trope, or some ambivalent things about this trope, which are that usually this figure was kind of like morally superior to everyone else in the film. Like some people were killed off because they were sexually, they were having sex in the film, or they were doing drugs in the film, or just behaving in some kind of a morally reprehensible way, supposedly according to really traditional morality, and that usually this final girl figure was somehow kind of like desexualized or somehow like morally elevated above these other figures, which isn't what we're interested in, obviously. This is not something that we are trying to give extra platform to at our festival. And I think you can see in the films that we showed, none of these figures are morally superior, right? So it's kind of it's like a jumping off place from which we want to kind of explore generally like female and queer and non-binary narratives that are being told, where these people are overcoming adversity to tell their stories, essentially, which is kind of mirroring this original trope. But yeah, there's obviously a lot more potential and like so much more to explore in the genre. And I mean, essentially, we're not even showing slasher films. I think that's really one of the subgenres we're least interested in, Ellie and I. So yeah, I think you can take this final girl trope and bring it to so many different places.
Yeah, that's interesting, because also when I was telling people about the screening tonight, a lot of people were like, oh, horror, I'm not sure if I can do that. And I think the films that we saw tonight, as you also said, are not like, it's not like the slasher film that you would expect. And what really struck me was like how they appropriate genre tropes. And I think very early on in our conversation, we asked you for a screening that you put together in the past, which had the theme cannibalism. And I think for some, like, I guess there was like kind of an intuition of like being interested in incorporation or appropriation, not only as like cannibalism per se, but also as a cinematic technique. And I was wondering, also, like, watching the films that you sent, of course there are genre constraints that are like showing certain limits or limitations, maybe for like even for the films that you show, like to count as horror. This is like maybe one thing, like an external limit from the genre, but then also maybe you could talk about like pick out like one or two films that we saw tonight where you feel appropriation or like incorporation of certain tropes, sort of digesting them becomes a tool of reinvention and going against certain standards.
And when you say tropes, do you mean specifically horror genre tropes, or tropes that could be related to gender and things? I mean, how?
I guess I am referring to the second one. Yeah.
Gender.
Okay, yeah.
It's a bit easier to answer in relation to these films, I think. I mean, well, the second to last film that you saw tonight with Entropia by Marinah Janello. This was kind of our like surprise snuck in film that we didn't have a link for it in time for you to get to like screen it in advance and decide if you wanted to show it before we just said, okay, we're throwing it in there. I think that like aging is a really major trope in female directed cinema. And particularly horror, and even before that, there was also kind of hagsploitation cinema, which has been made by men traditionally over, in the 60s, late 50s to early 70s, in which the aging woman is kind of the source of horror, right? So it's a lot about like how what is an older woman supposed to do? How is she supposed to age gracefully? How is she supposed to become invisible to society or only exist visibly in a very particularly limited way? And I mean, after having seen this film a bunch of times, tonight I was really paying more attention to the fact that she's really very alone in this film, actually. That there's, despite the fact that she is existing invisibly and in solitude and just in her own domestic space for the most part, except for when she sneaks to the public bathroom for her little heist. Despite the fact that she's not really in, dealing with any particular human gaze, she's still, everything is about imagining a gaze and talking to these taxidermied animals, imagining their gaze upon her, kind of creating this gaze. Obviously doing all of these like strange biohacks that she's kind of conjured up to evoke or to like to engender this kind of this youthfulness, which obviously is it's clear to see that it's not really working in any particular way. It's just this performance. It's like this ritual performance that she's doing. I think that this is kind of, it's important to show how violent these constraints are, and that if this is what is what we're being told to internalize, then it can manifest in really gruesome ways, and we can still be playful about it as well, right? We can still make cinema that's going to feel kind of inciting in some way, like exciting and inciting and making, you know what I mean? It's not meant to like. I feel like it doesn't feel like a static thing in this film, right? It's kind of like, okay, we can see that these structures are violent and limiting, but there's like room to subvert. There's room to play with it. Yeah, so that's one answer. I don't know if you want to respond before I go on, or. I mean, you did ask about 2 films, so I guess if you want me to answer about a second before you go on.
Yeah. No, I think in that one especially, that becomes like, so there's the theme of aging in Entropia. There's another theme where I think touching upon what you're saying, like those structures are made through the gaze, and the gaze is constantly reimagined or like constantly present, almost like an actor in all of the films. I'm thinking of Such Small Hands, the film that is set in this boarding school with this group of girls, where the gaze or the image that we know of the young girl, which is being sexualized, which is basically gender and sexuality, is put on this female body by the way we look at it, and it's subverted in several ways. I think in terms of like the body going through a change and growing into adulthood on the one side, that also being a kind of there also being like a kind of monstrosity in that, and on the other hand, there's the group dynamic and the violence between the girls, like the peers, that is also something that is being like inserted or like digested. What struck me with this one is there's a scene at the end where the other girls are kind of devouring her in a way, and there's like constantly also scenes of eating, like we see them the ritual eating together, like having lunch together, and so I really, maybe that's like more comment and a response, where I was struck by, and you sent a few films, like we picked this one where this like topos of, or the coming of age story becomes a very like futile and productive or fertile ground for exploring this this horror of like being horror of the gaze like sexualizing you and like putting you into certain gender roles and gender norms.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's interesting how many films we've received where like packs of young girls start to kind of like growl or bark like a dog, or and then end up having food fights, or just like covering themselves in food and kind of like growling primally. I think we could probably put together like a full program where that's a recurring trope. It's like something that people, a lot of filmmakers working today seem to be really keen on this particular expression. But yeah, about that film, I think again, like we're talking about the gaze, and almost everything that we see is happening really actually in a private space. Like it's a lot about kind of the like strange, dark, secret lives of these girls, and what they do at night. It's like in the middle of the night. Like it's all very like improbable and witchy, and like like they wouldn't be able to survive this for very long, right? To like not sleep at all for nights and nights. So it's all actually beyond like what is humanly seen as possible. But at the same time, I think anybody here who's female socialized knows that this is an extremely real depiction of what it means to like exist among other girls, and to like the kind of play that takes place, the kind of games, the kind of manipulation and like violence and things like this. So obviously it's not what's meant, it's not like what is taught as acceptable or exemplary or anything like that, right? This obviously is a very, we all know this statement, like girls are meant to be seen and not heard, et cetera, et cetera. There's kind of like, you're not supposed to be loud, you're not supposed to be messy, you're supposed to be a very like orderly being, which is the same exact thing for older women too, aging women, where it's like, oh, you're only allowed to be this like grandmotherly, right, figure who exists in a domestic space in a very safe way. And same thing goes for girls before they are sexualized. And so this is obviously showing that it's not such a neat and tidy existence that they have. And this is so I find that to be it's an interesting parallel between the three films that we programmed together, but that you selected from my larger program. That it's a lot about these kind of like dark secret lives of the characters, which I think is a really important thing that Final Girls Berlin is interested in showing.
I think maybe also coming back to this question of the gaze, one of my favorites of the screening is actually Alan Ender's Life at the Comedy Castle, where I'm always quite struck by like what Laura Moss, like it's the first film that we've seen tonight, which is this kind of comedy like scene, and I'm always quite struck what it does to see like an audience on screen, and especially with this like canned TV laughter, which is laid upon kind of the same faces and is repetition. And I mean also Ellen Anders is coming on stage like 3 times, and I think it produces this like very uncanny feeling of like kind of somehow identifying yourself with the audience like on screen, but while also knowing that kind of we're not part of it. But I think where kind of this gaze onto the like performer somehow like traces back to the live audience, like to ourselves in a way. Where I was also wondering, in terms of like horror film in general, how you would perceive the role of the audience, or if you get a lot of like immediate feedback during the Final Girls Film Festival screenings.
Yeah, I mean, the question of the horror audience is definitely a big one. There's been a lot written about horror spectatorship. I don't know if you know the Body Genres article by Linda Williams, where it's like porn, melodrama, and horror are the body genres. So the audience is meant to really bodily, like physically identify with what's happening on screen, right? There's the tearjerker in the melodrama, the fear jerker in horror, and the jerker in porn. So, I mean, it's supposed to be like a visceral, physical experience, essentially. Not always, but I think also like discomfort, just like alienation and discomfort are like a really big thing that horror is exploring and trying to provoke in the audience, where it's not necessarily about identifying, but a lot of the time it's about feeling alienated or disidentifying, or maybe identifying against your own will, right? Like not really wanting to have identification with what's going on screen, but maybe surprising yourself by the ways in which you might identify with something. So then there was the question about the Final Girls audience, or like how our interaction is with them.
Yeah, just because actually we've like when like thinking about the conversation, we've looked back to this, there is this documentation of a test audience of the chestbuster scene in like Alien, where you get all of those kind of weird reactions, and they're also like weirdly gendered in a way, because like the men are mostly like smiling or just like neutral, like kind of, I don't know, psychopath neutral, and all of the women are like screaming heavily. This is like iconic picture.
Interesting.
And I was just like wondering, because I mean also maybe thinking of, or maybe that's also like a big question for Anorak, is to think of like the kind of on-screen, off-screen presence in performativity, where I think, like also comparing like cinema to like theater. In theater, I think the audience would somehow be imagined to be a part of the whole thing, where in cinema it somehow like moved towards this like, I don't know, like just very bland, like not speaking audience in the black, which I think was very different also in the beginning of the cinema, because it was a cheap way to see theater basically. And I think I was just wondering like how you feel about, like people screaming in like Final Girls, if it happens. I don't know if it happens.
The horror that we're showing usually doesn't evoke screams. Laughter, yes, but or like kind of maybe noises like oh. But if you've ever been to like a multiplex, big budget horror film screening like in the US, then yeah, you hear a lot of audience interaction with what's going on. Talking, laughter, like making fun of what the characters are doing, or like, this is like a very common part of that sort of audience experience, which I think maybe is more so like a US or Anglo context than exists here. But also there's, in like the history of like horror that was coming out from the 60s to the 80s, there were certain filmmakers like William Castle. I don't know if you know about any of his work. He was known as like King of the Bees, of B horror movies, and he had a lot of gimmicks for his screenings, like I'm already forgetting The Tingler. Yeah, his film The Tingler. They put buzzers underneath some of the chairs, and then they would activate them and like surprise the audience, so that you never knew which seat had a buzzer, or there would be like a nurse coming through and. Like saying that like she's there in case anyone passes out, or I don't know, giving out pamphlets for something that's related to the film. Like these kinds of sort of where it's not as bland or divisive a division, between what's happening on screen and the audience, where there's really more of an interaction happening. So this is a bit of like an older thing that doesn't. There aren't as many filmmakers that are doing this like as actively around the country or around the world, but in film festivals you do see more of this. Like I was at Fantasia. Somebody gave out barf bags. This is a festival in Montreal, and for the film Booger, which is also we're going to show in February. Female director. Yeah, they gave out these barf bags for the audience. So obviously nobody threw up, but it's kind of it's like a sweet sort of anticipatory thing where you're like, oh, okay, you're waiting in line, you're holding this prop, and you're like wondering, how this is going to play in, and I think there are different ways that that filmmakers can choose to interact with the audience, and I think also a big part of like going to a horror film festival is also talking about the films really, in a very animated way afterwards with people, and like talking about the ways in which you experience it, not just like not in an analytical way, but it's a lot about this kind of like, oh, this scene I couldn't handle it, or it's a bit more about experience, I think.
No, totally, and I think it's also somehow related to this question of like humor in horror, or like the comedic quality of horror. Where I mean, we've also seen in the Cantor film, the footage of, both The Sound of Music, but also the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is one of the like only classics that I have seen in art school, because I usually just can't watch kind of horror films. But I think like what always strikes me is that with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like for example, is it's as much as it's like horror and like gore, it's also like a dark comedy, which for me I think is also like intended, at least in this like satirical way of depicting, like this like hippie road tripping community versus the kind of nuclear US hillbilly family in a way. Of course, like with a skin-made mask on the head, but I think it's still kind of related to, like those tropes of like the mother and like the father and like the two kind of. So yeah, I think to come to the question, I was just wondering whether you think that like humor is very much embedded in the like fabric of horror film, or if it's something that is more used to like break with the conventions of horror, as we've seen, for example, in Danny's Girl, with the over-exaggerated like screaming and like bringing in this like concentrated shots on like Danny's face, which is of course also mimicking, I think, the classic horror like way of dealing with the camera. Long story short, sorry.
Yeah. Well, about Texas Chainsaw with the laughter and comedy elements, I think you're kind of hinting at this, but this is like that dinner table scene where everyone is kind of taunting and laughing at the girl who's the final girl in the film, right? I don't think the audience is expected to be laughing there, right? But this is like, that's part of it, is that a lot of what horror is this kind of like misplaced laughter. It's a lot about like witnessing like revelry or joy at something that's like really horrific. And then that's like an integral part of the horror. So you're seeing, it's a lot of this kind of like laughter and merrymaking at something that's like super obscene and violent,
No, I was also wondering because I think there's also, like, maybe it's not so much about like humor and like the comedic and such, but also there's a lot of like slapstick, I have the feeling, where like people in panic just do like stupid stuff, where I think, like this kind of tripping over yourself or like running back into the building where you just like came from, running from whatever you murder or something, like for me is somehow like very, very often part of those films. And where I think, for example, like with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I don't think it's just something that we perceive like looking from 2023 onto like a movie that was made like 40 years ago, but I think it's somehow intended in the film itself as like a second layer. I mean, yeah.
I think that's very much dependent on what kind of viewer you are.
No, totally, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Shall we maybe open it to the audience at this point? Are there like any questions?
Johanna, it was actually your question, but I think it got lost in the. But I was curious how you define horror, or like what you consider horror, like what you include in the horror genre.
Yeah, I think that horror is a really broad and expansive genre, and it can mean many, many different things, and we're not really strict at all in our definition of that, and it changes year by year according to what we receive. But yeah, usually there are certain kind of like aesthetic elements to horror, like the sinister, the macabre, there are certain things. We don't want any happy endings, that's for sure. There's got to be kind of like a twisted and ambiguous thing going on that carries on until the end. And even if someone's coming away from it, like, that person is damaged for the rest of their life and is going to be traumatized, right? Like there's a lot of, I think, there needs to be something kind of like, there needs to be moral questions that are being dealt with in like a prolonged and nuanced and problematizing sort of way. Like discomfort in the viewer is usually pretty essential. Yeah, there's really, I mean, I'm kind of like listing a bunch of just sort of like associated things, but there isn't really a clean cut answer to that question, I think. And like for sure, like violence is not essential. It doesn't need to be a violent film. There doesn't need to be blood. Sometimes it's social horror. Sometimes like just dynamics among people can be really, really horrific. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it's something that I think is deeply like relatable to an audience because it's an essential part of life. I mean, we're experiencing horror around us at all times, right? So a lot of the films are very much like about these real life things, but usually there's also an element of the fantastical, like that's part of it. That doesn't need to mean like creatures or unreal figures, but that there's like, yeah, there's kind of a spin going on that is not related so much to the real world in which we live. Like usually it's a combination of these things. Do you two have any thoughts about what you consider horror?
I mean, maybe not so much about horror, but I think in a way what you were just saying maybe is also like very important for us to, like in the way we try to screen artist moving image screenings, I guess, where like I think it's both as like kind of bodily factor of it, like to have like the body as like being like a kind of sensorium like in the space, and also like this uncanniness or ambivalence, which is not so much bound to violence, but can also be bound to, yeah, kind of the screen presence and how like images are shifted and stuff. That's where I would kind of relate. I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I find it very interesting how you were immediately talking about audience reaction and like how much the audience is actually part of defining the genre. And I was just thinking about documentary film, for example, like what is the definition of that? Like how to depict reality, or like, yeah, how to document reality. I think maybe there you would come rather from like an intrinsic point of view in terms of like, yeah, how to make a film about I don't know, yeah, something that seems real, or maybe, you know, there's like, for sure, like certain, yeah, like other like methodologies that come with that, which are more coming from the filmmaking, you know, for example, like having interviews with people, or like, yeah, so that is maybe just more of a thought, like, that I'm very interested in, also in relation to what we've been talking about, that the gaze is like so overly, that is so important and displayed and becomes such an important agent. And of course, I mean, it just makes, I just had a revelation, like it just makes so much sense to like include the audience in that. And yeah, so defining it as, yeah, films that create or cause discomfort in the viewers, that's a very apt and interesting definition, I think.
Lately there's been so many films that are like grief horror, for example, which is just like a universal human experience, but like told through these kind of like blown up, you know, monstrified allegories. Yeah, so I think horror is like a really good tool for exploring things that are just real parts of human experience that are difficult to digest and ongoing, yeah.
Any more questions? Reactions?
One question, maybe it's a bit, I don't feel like, maybe it's a bit too broad, but I was just wondering when I was seeing the program also that you went a bit back in time also, and I'm pretty sure, or at least I'm assuming that you all have seen like horror movies, or in the broader definition of the genre, movies through all times, and I wonder what kind of changements in horror films you noticed over the times, or maybe especially in terms of female-based or female authorship films. That's what I was thinking.
I love these questions, but I always wish someone else were here to answer them. Yeah, I mean, I think horror in general over time, it changes a lot depending on what's happening in the world, like depending on what wars are going on or what's happening politically in a given country. Like this has a huge impact on the kind of horror that's being created. And then in terms of like, female or queer, trans, non-binary authored horror, I mean, this has a shorter life. First of all, like there was somebody. I mean, Ida Lupino made a couple of kind of genre films in the 50s. There were a couple people active in the 70s and 80s, but really when I say a couple, I mean I'm talking like a few, like 2 or 3 who made like studio-produced films. Independent films, sure. Things that haven't reached a big audience, of course. But in terms of like films that received funding and had wider cinema releases and stuff, this has been happening, just really for the last like 10, 15 years in terms of, like women directors making horror. So it's like unfortunately something that has a very short life, like new short life. And that's changing, of course. There have been like some major works, made in the last 10, 15 years that these directors like Jennifer Kent, for example, Karen Kusama, they had like a few films that have been funded and released. Julia Ducournau, I'm wearing one of her films on my shirt right now, Titan. I don't know if any of you have seen it, or her other film Raw. So there are a few who've won awards and are, but really this is, I wish I could cite more. And the way that it's changing, I mean, I think it's just only getting more complex and better, but of course that's not at all meant to be a slight to what came out earlier. I think there's a lot of complexity also in some of the earliest works, so I really wish I had a more specific answer for you. I think it's just like, there was also at the beginning more like, oh, we have to tell women's stories. Like there has to be like a really clear sort of like feminist perspective and like female lens, female gaze. And now it's becoming much more kind of just a broad approach to horror, which of course still, if you choose to dig in, you can still find ways in which that like, there is something that's important about the fact that a film starring a bunch of men was made by women, like or a woman. Like you can still find elements there where it's like, okay, this is definitely a female gaze at work here. I mean, we showed American Psycho on Halloween, for example, which was directed by Mary Harron and is like a scathing critique on toxic masculinity. But I think when it came out, which I think was like 99 or 2000, maybe I'm wrong, roughly around then. I don't know if that was quite as understood. Like I think people were just kind of like, oh, this is a really violent, messed up film. And now it's like we watched it. People were really laughing and like really like there was a lot of really brilliant critique in that film. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like the use of exaggeration in the genre of horror.
Yeah, it's pretty essential to it. I think. Yeah, I mean, real life is really horrific. So I think even that, like a film like Such Small Hands, I don't think it's that exaggerated. I think that can totally happen. And that it does happen, that like people kill their friends by accident while, getting, this is kind of like mob mentality or something, like being swept up in kind of a group dynamic, and group dynamics can be really dangerous and violent, and that's how a lot of horrible things happen in the world, right? So it's one tool. Like exaggeration is definitely an important and often used tool for evoking horror, or like kind of almost showing like, okay, by its exaggeration you can see how the more toned down version is actually the real source of horror or something like that. Yeah, it's sort of like a twisted way of doing it, but it's both are effective in that way. Do you have anything you're thinking about when you ask the question?
I wouldn't know where to start. exaggeration going to an extreme of like, I mean, I guess especially when it gets visceral, like also with like this like quick shots of like when she's stitching or like these kind of things, and then just like then also like extending a scene where you're like, okay, we can stop now here, but we're gonna go for it. How she's like sucking the tampons or.
Which we've also seen in a few other films that we've received, I have to say. Yeah, well, the first time we saw it was in that film, and we were like, oh, wow, we love that this film did that. Like, how cool. And now we're like, oh, again. Oh, someone else did it. All right, I guess this... like, people are interested in this. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, if so many people are portraying it, like, what does that say, right? I mean, it doesn't say that they're actually doing it, but, like, there's something actually... there's something at work there that I think is like, it's expressing a larger truth, right?
I think maybe let's, given the time, let's maybe wrap it up here. And I mean, you and we'll be around for a bit more. And so please come up and talk to us and have a drink with us. I think as a last thing, like, thanks again, Sara, and thanks to also like Edie, of course. Where I would also wanted to say that I think both of our initiatives are like kind of not funded like in a very basic way. So I think you have a Patreon on your website, right? Where I would highly recommend to go become a Patreon. And like with Anorak, we organize as a Kunstverein. So if you want to support like events like this, then you might want to consider become a member. And there's also our newsletter list right at the bottom. Okay.
Yes, I would also just mention that the festival's happening February 7th to 11th. Yeah. So if you want to watch a whole bunch more films like you saw tonight, it's going to be at City Kino Wedding, and there's going to be talks, workshops, panels, and a whole bunch of shorts and features. We show features too. So yeah, come out. It's going to be 5 days of nonstop feminist horror. So